Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Daniel Kelly. I'm the Academic Director for Graduate Programs at the Preston Robert Tisch Institute for Global Sport. Today in our Lunch and Learn series, we have an exciting topic on name, image, and likeness and the perspectives of stakeholders and practitioners who work in the field. The moderator for today's event will be Benjamin Slider. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly, and to Dan, Adam, and Doug, our panelists today. So as Dr. Kelly mentioned, our topic for this afternoon is on name, image, and likeness, the evolving legislation that's being pushed individually in different states throughout the country. Perhaps most notably in Connecticut a few months ago, but as recently as yesterday, we had Governor Kemp in Georgia sign some NIL legislation as well. So it's a hot button issue, especially here in our collegiate landscape with NYU. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for this afternoon. So first, we've got Dan Marcus, a Tisch Institute alum and current professor, is going to be able to offer some interesting perspective from the legal side of things. We have Doug Phillis, a former professor from the Tisch Institute. He's the founder of Accelerate Sports Ventures, a firm specifically designed to provide comprehensive NIL education and solutions to athletes and athletic departments. And then finally, we have Adam Honig, a current student at the Tisch Institute, who's a former collegiate basketball player and professional over in Israel, most notably with Maccabi Tel Aviv. Yeah. So we've got some very interesting panelists who will be able to talk about varying perspectives of this complex issue. So yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to add anything before we jump into it, now's the time. The floor is yours.
No, I just want to know, Adam, can we do part of this in Hebrew? I'm a little bit rusty, but I wouldn't be opposed to it.
Yalla.
I wish I could, but I think it sounds like you would beat me in that department.
I mostly just speak English with an Israeli accent these days.
So, that works.
That'll get you through Israel.
Yeah, not bad. I can how you say I can get by. Okay.
Very good. Very good.
And also we have a Q&A function through Zoom here. Anybody that's watching, if you'd like to submit any questions, feel free to do that through the Q&A, and we will get to you if we have time. So all that being said, let's just jump right into it. So anybody feel free to jump in if there's anything specific that I think is tailored to any of your specific backgrounds. I will call you out, but in general, feel free to jump in. So I mentioned the legislation that was introduced by Senator Chris Murphy in Connecticut a few months back. And the idea is that the College Athlete Economic Freedom Act would allow college athletes to make money off their name, image, and likeness with the fewest restrictions possible. So do you think substantive change within the NCAA has the potential to happen this time around?
I guess since I was the first one introduced, I guess I'll be the first one to take it. I don't know. I mean, there's I think we've all beat around this bush for a long time, in that the NCAA, to a certain extent, if you're sort of on the extreme end of the spectrum, I think is sort of worn out its utility, right? If you go back to the history of the NCAA, why was it started? It was started to, one, promote amateurism, and two, prevent people from dying. Football was a sport where you had a real percentage chance to die in the turn of the 20th century, and there was a spate of deaths, and it became a big thing for Teddy Roosevelt. But look at what it's become now. It's just become this governing body that makes a ton of money and is rife with hypocrisy, and has been so for a long time. Sure, they have a policing mechanism and authority. But by the same token, I think we're getting to that inflection point where all these things that everyone who was in the industry knew was happening under the table anyway is now coming into the limelight, such that the NCAA is being forced to change through the legalization of gambling, through public sentiment, through legislatures getting involved in NIL stuff. And so I think the NCAA will only bend to the extent that they feel it's going to be economically viable or fitting for them to ultimately bend and acquiesce. But at the end of the day, money talks, and I think that's ultimately what this is going to come down to. So I may have taken your question far afield, but let's at least start it out somewhat controversially.
No, that's great. I think you're spot on that, money and revenue is, what drives business in general, and the NCAA is no exception. Adam or Doug, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I just want to, ripe with hypocrisy is what stuck out to me in Dan's words. I think at the end of the day, it is about, dollar signs, and they will bend to whatever extent that they have to. It's not that, they're the ones willing to kind of go out on a limb here and try and sort of cater more to name and image and likeness, but it's really about what's being force fed to them. At the end of the day, the NCAA really just is looking at dollars and cents. So whatever they have to bend to, they will.
Yeah, so Ben, I'll also add to that. I think it's definitely happening, right? Name, image, and likeness is here. We're less than 60 days away in a handful of states, including Georgia, as you referenced, which signed it yesterday, Florida, which flip-flopped if you were following it a week ago, but then came back around to solidify the date of July 1, 2021. So with so many states have already passed it, there's many more considering it. As you referenced, there's a half a dozen federal legislation, which I think given how divided our politics have been in recent memory, you've got bipartisan support for name, image, and likeness federally. Now they differ on a handful of points, but it's happening, and now, right, the ecosystem has to figure out how to handle it, right? If you're on campus at a school, you need to figure out how your students are going to get educated. If you're a student athlete, you need to figure out, all right, how can I monetize this for myself and take advantage of my popularity in my hometown or my college town? So there's so many secondary effects, right, of name, image, and likeness. And a lot of it, I think, is going to create some really great opportunities for student athletes across Division 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to that same end, do you think, or why do you think the NCAA has been so hesitant, has been digging their heels in for so long?
Yeah, so for somebody who's worked in college athletics for 15 plus years, I would say the NCAA has always been slow to evolve, right? This one sticks out a little bit just because there's so much public support, and I feel like it's been that way for recent memory. But I've never seen them evolve quickly on anything. And I would agree with Daniel's comments at the beginning. They really look closely at what's best for them, right? And unfortunately, this one got out of hand for them. Like, this one should have been a one where everybody came to an agreement and this was positively received. But like Daniel and Adam referenced, like, these guys got forced to do it. And now it's happening, and you got to deal with the ramifications of that.
And I could add, just I think
Sure.
that was really spot on. I think the sponsorship model will change, and that's kind of what they're most scared about, where sponsors and companies, instead of going straight to their universities and colleges or even the governing body that the NCAA is, they'll go straight to athletes, and that could be a little bit scary to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these things are spot on. It goes back to what I said earlier. It comes down to money. It's no longer become about amateurism. I think amateurism has been a veil or a facade to be able to do all the other things that they do that are in their own self-interest. I mean, when you think about the NCAA, it's kind of like, if it's just such a long-standing institution, it's over 100 years old, that if all of the major schools that submit to the authority of the NCAA were to just pull out, it might be more beneficial. I know it's happened in the past with some of the Power 5 conferences trying to pull out as well, but there's no real need in a modern context for the NCAA to exist, especially when you have all of these schools going in their own different directions. I think there's a reason you're seeing states like Florida, states like California, states like New Jersey, et cetera, enacting their own NIL laws. It's because who are the highest paid public employees in those states? It's either the football coach or the basketball coach.
Basketball coach. Yeah.
Almost without exception, right? And so it's become a state, right? Like it's become a state revenue thing, and it's become a state competitiveness thing. So all it took was one to be like, listen, this is a huge competitive disadvantage. If people who play for UCLA or Berkeley or USC are going to have the added incentive of being able to get paid above board and make money above board, it's going to hurt you from a competitive standpoint. It's going to hurt you from a recruiting standpoint. And so really they're capitulating to public sentiment. They're capitulating to ultimately what states are doing. And because schools, major schools in terms of college sports, are either in these states or they're actually state schools, that it's forcing their hand. You can't have major college football without schools like Michigan, UCLA, and USC, and Berkeley, et cetera. So I think all of those reasons plus more are why they've been so resistant. But it still just comes back to the almighty dollar.
All right. I have a quick question. It's kind of a follow-up to Daniel Marcus's point, but it's more of a question for Doug. So I know, Doug, you're working with student athletes education as far as understanding their rights and privileges under NIL. Have you tried to tailor your educational curriculum to the different states, or you just doing an overall package?
Yeah, so you make a great point, Daniel, right? You got to be really cognizant of, who you're talking with and where they're competing, because today there are different state laws, right? And there's no NCAA policy that has been approved yet, and there's no federal legislation, right? The interesting thing about NIL education is there are some really basic fundamentals that the rules almost don't matter, right? And I'll give you a handful of examples, right? Tax. Student athletes for the first time are going to have to understand, all right, we're creating revenue for ourselves, but now I've got to pay taxes, right? And so just something as fundamental as that is a really important educational piece, right? There's education around contracts, right, and negotiations, and they've never been in a opportunity to get paid X to do Y, right? And how does that work from a negotiation standpoint for them? And how can they leverage supply and demand, right? So there's some fundamental things that I think are really important that aren't impacted by the rules, right? It's basic business 101. But at the same time, I couldn't agree more. You have to be really cognizant, specifically today, when dealing with athletes and educating them around NIL, just because there's such a different landscape dependent from state to state.
I appreciate that. Good details. Thank you. And I have a follow-up question for Adam, though. So Adam, I'm going to ask you a question more about thinking about hindsight, which they say is 2020. During your experience as a student athlete, would it have impacted where you went to school based on NIL being available to you as well?
Certainly. I think first and foremost, it would affect the recruiting process immensely. I think, like Daniel just mentioned, like Doug just mentioned, if there are certain states that are tailored to name, image, and likeness, and you see a possible path where you can benefit off of that as a student athlete, you're definitely going to go visit schools in those states. So the recruiting process, what coaches you're talking to, or coaches I was talking to back in the day, definitely would have played a huge a role in where I would go to school. And then the other piece of that is educating myself. You don't want to be taken advantage of, especially in college as an athlete, when there's monetary value, like there will be. So it would play a huge role as far as recruiting, as far as where you visit, who you're talking to, and ultimately your decision to go to school.
And for Daniel Marcus, my last question in this round is, with the legal pressure with other states opening up their NIL provisions and laws, do you think it's going to be a ripple effect to allow other states to follow suit?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing it right now. We're already in the middle of the ripple effect, right? Like Doug mentioned this. There's laws on the books that are still slated to go into effect by July. There's one in Arizona, there's one in Georgia, et cetera. So they're all coming online. And the reason that Chris Murphy's proposed federal legislation is because if you have this patchwork of a bunch of different state laws around NIL, compliance is going to be a bear. It's going to be unbelievable, especially if there's a lack of uniformity. So, from a legal standpoint, I think to your question, Daniel, we're already in the middle of that ripple effect. That's why there's such a push, even from the NCAA. So you have all of these different stakeholders pushing for the rules that they want. Okay. So the NCAA is pushing for their own set of rules in federal legislation. So they have an idea of what that looks like. The Power Five conferences came out with literally a one-page bulleted press release. It was like, this is what we'd like in a federal law. This is what we propose as rules that would be fair. And then of course you have legislators and people that are on the player side or on the student athlete side of things proposing their own rules. And so I think the only coherent way to do this is to have a federal law, but there are so many, it's such a slippery slope, because you could theoretically have both, and we can get into what that looks like, but you could have a federal and a state law that regulate two separate things at the same time, or two separate pieces of the same thing, which just lends itself to, you're not going to, even if there's a law in the books, everything's going to get litigated. The courts are going to help determine and refine what exactly it is you can and can't do. And it's going to be evolving for decades.
Adam, I wanted to ask you, when you were playing professionally over in Israel, did you ever talk with your teammates and kind of compare and contrast all of your collegiate experiences, like what you had over at Dickinson versus what they had, whether in Israel or other colleges around the world?
Certainly. So over the course of my career, I played with so many different types of players, where as far as nationalities, where they went to school, where they grew up. For me, I went to a smaller school in Dickinson, but I played with guys from Power Five conferences, major, mid-major, guys that played in the ACC, Big Ten, big time school. So the recruiting process is definitely talked about often within locker rooms and off the court. I think there are a lot of things that go on that I think a lot of people know about. And yeah, it's definitely talked about, and just as far as what's really brought to light and what's not. But everybody's path is a little bit different. And a lot of that, it starts in college. College sports it's such a powerful piece to somebody's life if they're able and to play a college sport. And it shapes you moving forward. And if you play at the next level, like I was able to over in Europe, I think getting everybody's perspective, and like Dr. Kelly said, hindsight being 2020, there are some things you would do differently, but hearing everybody's path, it's certainly interesting. And I think the name, image, likeness conversation we're having right now, it would add to those conversations immensely.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we can start with Doug here, but I'm curious in all three of your takes here, how would you see any potential NIL changes affecting your day-to-day in, anything that you do in the scope of NIL?
Yeah. So look, Ben, my company was created solely to address name, image, and likeness, right? So the fact that there was momentum for this rule change and for some legislation, we saw it and felt like it was a great opportunity for us to help educate athletes, right, in a variety of levels, to prepare for this seismic shift, right, where they're now going to be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. So for me, it has been significant, right? It's changed everything because, for somebody with experience in sponsorship, licensing, endorsements, and education, having taught at the Tisch Center for the last decade, it felt like a perfect collision course, for me, for my background. And also love, I'm a former student athlete myself, so love supporting student athletes and working with them, and did that in my roles on campus previously. So for me, it was a perfect fit, and really excited about what the future holds. And I agree with Daniel, like this thing's going to evolve and evolve and evolve, and it's going to keep evolving over many years, but excited to be at the forefront of it.
Okay, we got a great question that just came in from one of our attendees, Fadi Hamdi. For the panelists, do you foresee a market being formed of self-proclaimed agents looking to take advantage of the student athletes? And at what age do you think student athletes should start being educated on this issue? Fantastic questions.
Yeah, so Ben, I'll jump in because I've dealt with some people who don't have any experience in the agent world who have already jumped out and said, "Hey, I'm jumping into this space. I'm going to represent athletes
Yeah.
because I have relationships with athletes." Okay, what do you know about representing them, right? And so they need to get educated themselves. So yes, to the first question, I'm concerned about that. We want to make sure that student athletes, the endorsement space, right, has been around for quite some time and is sophisticated at the pro level. And so now you're putting hundreds of thousands of student athletes into this ecosystem. We want to make sure that they're well prepared and educated. And I would answer the second part of the question of, I think you need to start getting educated in high school, right? If you're thinking about it, Adam, think about your how you got recruited, right? And all of a sudden, name, image, and likeness is now a topic that coaches are talking about. I had one high school recruit tell me, he goes, coaches are talking to me about NIL. I don't know what it is, right? And so I think it's really important to start to get at least a foundation and an understanding in high school. And I think it'll help you take advantage of those opportunities when you do get to college.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you said is right, Doug. I think, well, if you think about the agency or just the profession of being an agent, whether it's in sports and entertainment, I mean, with all due respect to people that do that stuff, I don't think it's been an industry that's been known for the robustness of its moral fiber to begin with. So that's always been the case, right? You've always had the agency business is extremely, or like the representation business is extremely tough. Loyalty isn't a word that really means a lot to a lot of people in that space. So there's always going to be people, hangers on, circling programs, especially where there's money to be made, clients to be procured, et cetera. And there's still going to be, like, even with the ability to get NIL money, there's still going to be these under the table deals for more money and other things. People who have dads who need Range Rovers, and people that want like no-show, title-only consulting gigs with certain schools and programs. So I think that's always going to exist. I think what this might do is it might bring out of the darkness and into the light some of the people that you would want to otherwise catch who do this stuff anyway. But because they can do it in a somewhat above board way, you're actually being able to separate the good from the bad. So I think that's good. And I think, yeah, listen, it's an overall macro trend as far as younger athletes. You see a lot of specialization, people that don't play 4 sports anymore, multiple sports anymore. They play one and their parents put them into it. They're playing AAU ball, the big basketball, baseball, etc. And I think earlier on they're getting prepared for that next level. And I think, to Doug's point, I think high school, if not earlier, is a great time to do it. Especially if you're on a track where you're going to be at a big time program and you can actually take advantage of your name, image, and likeness from a monetization standpoint.
All right, so a quick question then for Daniel Marcus then. Does this open the door then for regulation from the NCAA? Like for instance, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, MLB, they all have registered agents. They all have a process. You take an exam, you follow requirements, an application process, a fee. Would it open the door for the NCAA to regulate it that way?
Well, you know what? I'll tell you a funny thing that when I was preparing for this, I came across. So there's actually a federal law that George W. Bush signed into law in 2004 called SPARTA. Don't ask me to rattle off what the acronym stands for. But point being is that law was intended to regulate agent conduct around non-professional sports. But I don't think there's one instance of it being used or applied or enforced. And so, is that the domain of the NCAA? I ask, in the grand scheme of things, in the hierarchy of regulatory power, who is the NCAA, right? The NCAA it's kind of like the notion of, being a government relies on the consent of the governed, at least in this country. And so in that same analogy, the NCAA's power relies on the power that its constituent schools give it. And so if I'm a constituent school, I would say I don't want the NCAA regulating this because they've shown a pattern in history of bungling so many things in this respect that I think you would want it to go to either a state commission or a federal commission. But then there's issues of who becomes a subject matter expert, et cetera. And so I think you're going to have a patchwork. I think the easy thing to say is to have the NCAA to do it and say, if this is your job. But if I'm a member school and I look at the future, I just go, I don't want to continue to have the NCAA play an even bigger role than it's already playing. I try to phase them out, frankly, more so than give them more responsibility.
So we've been talking about, that great question about, when is the appropriate time to begin to prepare yourself and talk about representation? Are there any other measures that you guys think that student athletes should be thinking about to protect themselves and their brand, whether in high school or younger, or, all the way at the end of their collegiate career?
I would definitely jump in and say, for people that are sort of in this world or preparing, just because you hire an agent doesn't mean you don't have to be educated. And you have to understand IP. You have to understand where fees go if you even have an agent or if you don't. As far as when you want to start preparing, which was a great question in the Q&A, if you're have potential to play in college, you're most likely going to be attending camps and recruiting camps freshman, sophomore year of high school. And there are obviously times where you can talk to coaches there, and there are times where you're not allowed to. But as we move forward, a part of coaches' pitches will be name, image, and likeness, and how it can apply to you. So if you aren't prepared in those talks, it could really backfire. It could help you. It could hurt you. But in someone that used to have an agent, you can't always trust your own agent. I think, to Daniel's point, it's not known to always be the most moral business, and you have to protect yourself by educating yourself, and that's very, very important, whether you have an agent or not.
Ben, can you remind me what the question was? I'm sorry, I hate to be.
Yeah, no worries. Just basically, the measures that student athletes should be taking, or things to consider to keep in mind as we're thinking about ways to protect themselves and their brand.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a biased answer, but I think I think having someone who understands what enforcement looks like around this stuff is important. So I tend to work with, as an attorney, I tend to work with a lot of players who are at the tail end or who are moved on to the next chapters in their careers, and so post-playing careers. And so this is a shameless plug for him. But one of the guys I work with is both Daniel and Ben, is a guy named Spice Adams. Spice Adams, people don't know that he played football for a decade. They just know he's the funny guy on Instagram making memes and videos. And so when that happens, you have a lot of people that are like, "Oh, this is great. I'm going to use this." Well, you can't use it because this is a picture that you don't own. That is of somebody that's not you, and you don't own the copyright, you don't own the rights to it. And so I think enforcement is going to be a really big thing, because if you're, I don't know, like if you're, say, someone like Zion Williamson, for example, 2 years ago, your image, your name, your face, everything is being tossed around the internet willy-nilly without you seeing a dime for it. And so having someone that understands what enforcement should look like, how you create sort of like a dragnet to be able to catch these things, I think is an important part. But like I said, it's a biased take.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Ben, I think you need to think about your brand holistically, right? Your on-field brand, your off-field brand, how do they complement each other? Are you someone who you get interviewed after the game and you're thanking your teammates, right, for setting the picks and getting you the ball, right? Or are you complaining about the refs, right? So I think everything impacts your brand, right? And we teach brand is reputation, right? And so everything impacts that. And so I think if you want to be successful in name, image, and likeness, you need to be strategic and intentional about what you put out there, because that's going to have a really big impact on the opportunities that you're presented with.
And I know a lot of times we hear about NIL and we think about the money. What about the money being used for good causes? I think this past season, wasn't there a big issue with Trevor Lawrence when he set up a GoFundMe account for a charity? And of course, it almost jeopardized his eligibility for college football. And, when an athlete puts their name towards something that's not benefiting them directly, but there is money being generated off of their name, image, and likeness, what do you foresee the rules being in the future about philanthropy and charity when it comes to NIL?
Yeah, so I'll just say this, Daniel. In the first go round of the NCAA policy, it basically referenced that the athletes would have the ability to do that, right? Is to put their name, image, and likeness out there for charitable causes, right? And I think the Trevor Lawrence example is a great one, right? He wanted to step up and help.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see so many student athletes who want to do that, right? Whether it's a local cause, around campus, or something more high profile nationally. And again, I think all that can do is build goodwill and enhance the brand, not only of the athlete, but the school, right? Who they are representing, whether it's in tandem or not, right? Whether you can use a school logo or not. Trevor Lawrence went to Clemson and they are aligned, right? That's a part of his brand forever. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he went out and did some philanthropic work and really gave back to the community looks good upon the school and as well as him. So I think you're going to see more of that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You mentioned like a really important piece of this, Daniel, which is eligibility. Who determines eligibility? The NCAA. Why was that an issue? Because there's no rules from the NCAA and there was nothing compelling them to enable him to do this. So I think in a paradigm and in a world where there are rules, whether they come from the federal government, state government, the NCAA themselves, it just seems silly to have something like that, especially if it's for a good cause, not be a carve out in whatever new rule there's going to be. And so I anticipate without question that there's going to be a safe harbor and a carve out for stuff like that, especially if you're going to get paid for being able to do like appearances and commercials for your local car dealership in Mobile or Huntsville, Alabama, et cetera.
So we've touched on this, right? Like obviously any changes within the scope of the NIL and the NCAA are going to have some major ramifications like wholesale. But I want to hone in specifically on sponsorship. How do you see like the sponsorship model, whether from the school perspective or the athlete perspective? How do you see this shifting with the introduction of NIL legislation?
Yeah, so Ben, I would say you're definitely going to see a shift, right? And I would tell you the collegiate sponsorship business, particularly at the Division I level, is a lot different than professional sports, right? You use a multimedia rights holder, right? A third party who represents the school, which is different, right? In pro sports, everybody for the most part, works internally within the organization. And so you have these third-party rights holders who are paying guarantees in most cases to schools for the ability to sell those rights. And now with NIL coming online, you have sponsors have so many more opportunities, right? They've never had this opportunity to work with student athletes. And now you're just going to give them options, right? And so it could be a really great way for sponsors to align with the college even more so, because the athletes can amplify the messaging. And additionally, if you haven't sponsored the university or the sports program previously, this could prompt you to jump in for the first time and do an athlete endorsement, especially with the rise of social media, right? And all of the things technology can help and the innovation on that side. I think there are so many more ways and so many more options for sponsors and brands to get involved.
Adam, I was giving you that pause was me giving you your moment to jump in. So if you wanted to take it, cool. I just don't want to hog the mic.
No, I think Doug touched on a lot of points I was going to mention. I think I touched on it briefly as far as the sponsorship model changing, but really to relate it back to the student or the athlete educating themselves, they have to understand that they can't just align and partner and sponsor with just anybody. If there's a conflicting sponsorship with their school and they don't understand the rules and they don't understand, the landscape, they could get themselves in a lot of trouble. So obviously my point of it, as far as educating themselves, holds very true and important as far as, their opportunities moving forward. But sponsors love name, image, likeness. They love this opportunity. It not only raises their ceiling as far as connecting with athletes, but you can relate that to connecting with schools even further as well.
It's going to be the wild, wild west. I'm super interested to see all of these things. It's going to be so funny because it's really just going to depend upon what the ultimate consequences are going to be. It depends also how you define sponsorship, right? If you look at all of these bills, so many of them are either, one of the key things, and so many of them is whether a student can have a sponsor or an endorsement or a contract with a company that conflicts with one of the contracts that the program has, that the team has, that the school has, etc. But it's gonna be amazing. Think about the content play of this, because that's going to be such a piece of NIL. Is, you know, if you're someone at a big school, let's say you're like a Trevor Lawrence, you develop a pretty big following, and if you're funny and interesting and good on social media, you could really ramp that up, and you could be doing sponsor posts on Instagram and Twitter, etc. You know, I could see every hacky thing being done. I'm super interested in like the very provincial local sponsorship market. You know, being able to do radio hits and local TV hits for small businesses. I mean, if you think about where some of these colleges are, these are small college towns. Like, what's Charlottesville, Virginia? You know, what's some of these other, what are these towns outside of these institutions? So to me, from an entertainment value, I love small town radio spots anyway. So I think that would be amazing. But the more material issue that you're going to see is whether there's going to be any allowance by the schools to use their marks and their names. So if you are from the New York area and have seen Toyota commercials with Eli Manning, he's wearing this like generic blue jersey because he doesn't have the rights to use the marks. So I think you'll probably see a lot of generic, you know, orange, blue, red, whatever team colors are jerseys and things in these spots. But I think it's going to be super entertaining at the very least.
You know, that point you just made about using the university marks and the logos from the schools, that was actually a question in the chat from Russell White, one of our former students who just graduated. So I want to follow up on Russ's question to ask you, Daniel, about would the universities be willing to open that gate where normally that gate has been closed as far as using the university marks? Because I'm sure they're going to want a piece of this pie, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think is yet to be determined. I think that might go into what the legislation looks like. And I think it's going to be more of a prohibition, because if you're the school, intuitively you're like, no, you can't use my mark. They're worth something. You have to get a license, et cetera, especially if we're not seeing a cut of this. But I think the market dynamics might shift it in a way where, to be competitive, you might want to allow students, if you're trying to recruit the #1 5-star recruit in basketball, football, et cetera, and you want to sweeten the pot in an above board way, just be like, yeah, you can we'll let you use the University of Michigan or Ohio State or Clemson's marks in conjunction with your sponsorships. It's all subterfuge, really. Like the fact that you're allowing students to get paid vis-a-vis NIL, there's going to be a lot of otherwise under the table cash transactions and money deals that were made under the table, but now that are going to be made under the guise of NIL. Like someone's going to get like a rights deal that's going to be a rights deal that's all encompassing, but it's going to just be like a bunch of cash that you normally get through a booster and some shell company, but now you're just going to get it through an NIL deal.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier about it being the Wild West, and that kind of makes the case right there about how people are going to figure out a way to get around the system and corrupt it. So, yeah.
So I wanted to shift to a different topic within this similar realm. So video games, college video games have played a very interesting role in this topic. You could argue that Ed O'Bannon finding himself in a March Madness game in the early 2000s like kicked off this whole discussion of the rights of student athletes. Recently, EA Sports has been talking about bringing back NCAA college football. You know, I'm curious what you guys think the role of video games, you know, in the past and going forward has been with this discussion.
I think that, I mean, Ben, for those that are watching, Ben is one of my students. I teach a business of esports class. So I feel like this was geared towards me. So I'll take it. I'll take it first, at least. Yeah. I mean, obviously the college video games have always been this like weird sort of it's almost laughable, right? In the way that they've done it in the past. The guy that graduates the year before becomes the cover athlete with their team's marks and logo the next year. I remember having college or NCAA basketball 2K7 with JJ Redick on it the year after he graduated. No, I think it's played a huge role. I think to my knowledge, and Doug, you might be able to correct me on this one, but when you sign on as an NCAA athlete and your scholarship, you basically signed away any rights you had to use your name, image, and likeness, which is basically why we're even talking about this stuff. And so the NCAA would have the ability to negotiate those rights deals the same way that the Players Association negotiates those rights deals.
Right.
And so I think it's played a huge role in shifting the tide. Obviously, the Ed O'Bannon case had a lot of publicity, and so we're moving that direction in video games. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think it's total. You would have, for example, you'd have everybody from the roster digitally created on these of these schools. You know, you'd have like a Mark Sanchez, you'd have a whomever, and it's very clearly Mark Sanchez, or it's very clearly JJ Redick, but they would just be generic person, you know, Joe Smith. So that's clearly a flagrant violation. I think the other topic that's going to be important here as it relates to NIL in the context of video games, if you're a publisher of video games and you can't get all of them, or like you can't get a batch license for so many names and likenesses, it's going to be impossible to have a game that's not going to look like a crazy patchwork of people that you got a license for and people that you didn't. And the way that this works in pro sports is that it's usually done through the Players Association, and they negotiate that. And so I think what we're going to see is some sort of organized bargaining unit that's going to be able to do this and negotiate these kinds of licenses on a batch, on a batch basis. And I'm sure you're going to also see the equivalents of the Barry Bonds, who famously opted out of being pictured in the baseball video games during his playing career, or Bill Belichick, who is notoriously not allowed his likeness to be used in Madden and other video games, wanting to do their own thing. But I think overall, yes, video games have played a huge role, and it's going to be an interesting issue to see what happens with them in the future. I don't think the NCAA is going to have the luxury of being able to negotiate the rights deals for those things anymore.
Yeah, before Doug or Adam jumps in, I just wanted to say, you know, I always thought it was laughable, you know, you'd have these old NCAA football games, and it's not Tim Tebow, it's quarterback number 15 for Florida, who's a lefty with, you know, pronounced eye black. But no, it's not Tim Tebow. And, you know, where's the line?
Yeah, I would jump in, Ben, and say, you know, EA has planted the flag as the hero, right? By them announcing, we're bringing back the game, and if we don't have the likenesses, we're going to bring back a generic game. You know, they've planted the flag as the hero because this game has been the calling card of name, image, and likeness. So many people want the game, right? And Ed O'Bannon even said it. He goes, some people got mad at me when I brought the suit because it took away the video game. And he's like, that wasn't my intent. My intent was to make sure we got compensated for it. So I think EA, it was very smart and strategic to do that. And then if you follow the timeline, Senator Murphy's bill came out a few days later, and it had group licensing as a part of it. So I think there's a lot of strategic and political maneuvering going on to get this in a place where it could be beneficial for everybody. And look, group licensing means there's more money for everybody. So there's certainly some benefit to it for the entire ecosystem of college sports and the athletes.
Yeah, I think all really great points, and I don't have a whole lot to add on the subject just because, you know, I think you all hit the nail on the head. But it'll be what I'm most curious about. It'll be interesting to see if they can formalize a union, in which case they can, you know, have that universal, you know, video game where, like Daniel said, if you're going to patch together, you know, here's number 4, but here's JJ Redick, and it just wouldn't really make sense. It wouldn't look right. I think there's a ton of opportunity from both sides to it. So it'll just, from my perspective, it'll be interesting to see sort of the layout and how they can piece it together.
All right, I have a bit of a transition question. This one came from the Q&A, and it's from Russell White once again. Question for Doug and for anyone else, especially with Doug in your competitive work with accelerate sports ventures? Are you finding that there's now a competitive marketplace that you're competing against? Or do you feel like what you're doing with Accelerate is now being brought into as a division for larger agencies like Wasserman or CAA? Good question.
Yeah, really good question. It'll be interesting to see how the bigger agencies evolve. Right now it feels like most of them are so focused on the sales side, right, of selling on behalf of athletes, right? And we're on the complete opposite side of that, right? We're educators. We're in no way, shape, or form creating deals for the athletes. But yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of companies. There was a Sports Illustrated article last week that 150 companies have popped up in the NIL space, right? And a lot of them are on that sales side, marketplace side, right? Bringing sponsors and athletes together. So for sure, it's going to be very competitive. When I announced the formation of my company last year, there was a handful of us, in the NIL space. And now there's more than 150. So I expect it to be really competitive, but then also, it'll be interesting to see where people end up, right? Do the bigger agencies create divisions? Is there consolidation? So it's going to evolve much like the NIL space from a rules and just how it all evolves as we go forward and get more comfortable with it.
Where do you see the means for differentiation? Is it different sports or maybe men's versus women's collegiate athletics? Is there any potential you see to really diving into a niche here?
For sure. Well, I think one, right? So from my standpoint as an educator, we need to educate all athletes, right? And so if we're working with an institution, it doesn't matter if it's a 5-star recruit or a walk-on, you both have an ability to generate revenue from your name, image, and likeness, and you both have the ability to tell a story, right? And create your narrative. And so for kids who are really great at creating content, that's one avenue, right? There are kids who are going to be like maybe Adam, right? You could have done a basketball camp, right? And created this great, you have this great audience who followed you, whether it was from your hometown or right outside the college, and they all wanted to, go to your basketball camp. There are kids who are really artistic, right? And just think about in 5 minutes, they could set up a Shopify store and start generating revenue based on, how artistic they are. So there's so many opportunities. And I think you will see some people who, again, are strategic and intentional, Ben, are going to be the ones who are able to go out and benefit on this. And Adam, I'd be curious, given some of the people you've played with and even yourself, like if you had a chance to go do NIL, how would you, what route would you go?
First thought is always social media, I think, especially now. What you just mentioned was like a light bulb in my head, kind of, setting up a store, an online store, Shopify account. I think that's an amazing idea. And just hearing that, like, wow, I would contact Accelerate Sports Ventures for some advice, a little plug there. But no, I think social media, everybody's a content creator now. If you're good at it, you can really benefit off of it. So my first thought would be content creation, social media, partnering with people that could help. But I think that's where the clicks are, that's where the buzz is, and that's where a ton of opportunity is.
Yeah. And hey, Ben, I'm sorry to ask some more questions.
No, by all means.
But Daniel, I'd love to ask you this. This is something that came up in an education session we did the other night, and it was talking about domains, right? And athletes, the discussion point got to, hey, should I go get my domain, right? And this was a high school kid before. He's like, I've got a shot to play in college. And so we had a long discussion about it. Curious your advice, right, on securing domains, but also when people, the example that we walked through was, hey, somebody bought this athlete's domain and then they had to go and try to purchase it. They couldn't purchase it. Then they had to alter, their own name, right, to do their initials to put up their own domain. So would love your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, domain names are funny. So I come at this from two perspectives. So like I'm wearing my lawyer hat today, but in addition to doing that, I'm just a very big startup guy, having started a bunch of companies myself, specifically like in the tech space. So I personally, this is funny. I actually own one or two domains that may or may not have an athlete that I've worked with's name in it. And I think just from a straight up business standpoint, so I'll give you the business take on this. I think it maybe mitigates the legal take on it, which is, I don't think domains mean as much these days. Like it used to be, oh, I need like the snappy.com. It doesn't really matter. With SEO and SEM, search engine optimization, search engine marketing, like if you have all the backlinks and you're the destination people want to go, people will find you. People don't normally go to your website. They go to Google first, because no one, like very few people remember domain names. So I think it's becoming less and less important. Sure, would I want danmarcus.com if there weren't a million of us and a lot of them weren't born before me? Absolutely. But I don't think it's that important. It's really not that important, because there's so many access points for other people to find you, and they're usually not your website immediately. From like a cyber squatting standpoint and how that relates to rights of publicity, which is now we're calling NIL, very interesting. I've not encountered this. So I'm going to defer on what the body of jurisprudence is as to like what you can and can't do. But rest assured, if someone buys trevorlawrence.com and is commercializing things that, shirts, hats, whatever, with his name on it and his face on it, rest assured there will be a C&D letter and or a lawsuit, if not both, as someone attempts to do that. And so the question then becomes, what's the value of the domain and having the person's name in the domain if you can't really commercialize it? You're cyber squatting at that point. So that's my take. Hopefully there were some good answers in there.
That was good. That's good.
So for any current student athletes or current student athletes looking to benefit from these changes, I mean, we've kind of touched on some advice, some thoughts of best practices, anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to offer?
So Ben, I would just use the old John Wooden quote, right? Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And a lot of these athletes know this is coming, right? So get prepared. Like, Adam just had a great thought about, hey, this is what I would do in social media. So if you start thinking you have a plan, right, or you're starting to formulate a plan, get prepared, get educated, and then be ready to execute when this opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I mean, Adam, you go ahead. I saw you coming off mute. Please go.
Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot to add to that. Educating, the theme from my end has been educate yourself. One, the work starts on the court, on the field, whatever, whatever sport it is that you play, and that's the avenue to your success. If you can establish that, then you obviously have to educate yourself and put the right people around you that won't hurt you and can only help you, because there's a lot of room for error in all of this. So it's just educate yourself, perform at a high level, obviously, and capitalize, really, because there's opportunities coming in the pipeline that we haven't seen before, and they will be huge. So educate yourself, perform, and capitalize.
Yeah, Adam, basically the last point was my advice, which was essentially get that money. But don't be so dumb. Well, don't think that you're smart enough to be able to do it yourself. I think that's a big lesson that people learn in a lot of walks of life, in a lot of different contexts. And so don't sign anything without anyone looking at it. That's another good rule of thumb.
Always the rule, right?
Great advice. And I think having a great support system around you is awesome advice, regardless of what we're talking about. Surrounding yourself with smart people that are looking out for the best for you, it's only going to put you in a better position in life. All right, so I guess just to wrap things up, for students watching now interested in a career in sports law or player rights, or maybe a current student athlete looking to follow a path of Doug or Adam, what any recommendation or advice?
Well, Ben, I would just say, as a product of the program, it was one of the best decisions I ever made, right? Going through Tisch, the networking with classmates and faculty is something that I still rely on today. So for those who are in the program, take advantage of it, because it's incredible. And it was one of the best decisions and one of the most, helpful things I've done in my career. So it's hard to break into sports, and this was absolutely a huge catalyst for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When I stopped playing basketball professionally, I came back to the States. I took a job with the NBA League office where I'm currently working in replay operations. But when I decided to go back to school prior to the pandemic, before I even applied, I called Dr. Kelly and we had a conversation just about, what it would look like, what it would entail, and how I would benefit from it. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I think furthering your education, it will never hurt you. And NYU is such a great established place where, between guest speakers and our professors within the program itself, I'm finishing up in August. I'm on track to finish up in August, and I feel so much more prepared as far as my next move and my next transition and just moving forward. So again, the theme is educating yourself, but that can't be understated. And just really from there, you can go for it.
Yeah, I think my advice is both general and specific. General in the sense that I think you can apply it to all sorts of industries, and that's one thing I think you learn over time is that life is a people business, and you should make it your objective, especially when you're at NYU and if you're in this program. So many people I went to school with didn't realize it at the time. They're like, oh, okay, so and so is speaking at this thing. Well, no, you should go and you should ask questions and you should be engaged and you should have an opportunity to have a conversation. Like these things add up like compound interest, and they'll pay dividends on the back end, which is an analogy I just came up with off the top of my head, but I like it. And then lastly, I think that you always got to put yourself in positions to let fate extend its hand. You don't know that something's going to happen, but if you're in a position to allow something to happen, more things tend to happen. So, if there's any, if that's my way of putting a bow on this, then hopefully it suffices.
I appreciate that. I think that's all really great advice. So yeah, I will pass it off to Dr. Kelly then. I thank you everybody for watching and to our panelists today, and very much appreciated all your time. And I thought this was awesome. A lot of great info here. Dr. Kelly.
All right, great work, Ben. Thank you, Daniel Marcus. Thank you, Adam Honig. Thank you, Doug Phillips. We really appreciate the perspective and the information that was gathered today for our students. And for everyone else out there watching, please be on the lookout for our next iterations of the Lunch and Learn series, as well as our Insider Industry series as well. Take care.